Okay, there are still a couple of outstanding things left to discuss in Chapter 35. We've already discussed indirect command. Next, let's talk about another tense of the subjunctive that we're learning. Remember, subjunctive is a mood. You might think of it as the non-indicative mood. That is anything that's not statement of fact. And as you've seen, there are different tenses of the subjunctive. So far, we've learned the present and the imperfect. Now we're going to learn the third of the four tenses of the subjunctive, and that is the pluperfect. If you turn to page 132, you'll see a guide for the morphology, and you'll see it's really quite simple, as easy as the imperfect was before this. And that is to say, you take the perfect stem, and that should make sense to you since it's a pluperfect. Remember, the pluperfect indicative, like the perfect and the future perfect, all use that perfect stem. So here too, quite logically, we're going to use the perfect stem. Now to that perfect stem, we're adding a new set of endings. We'll think of them, as the book suggests, as the pluperfect subjunctive endings. And that they're there on page 132. Isem, isses, isset, isemos, issetis, issent. Now, as an aside, there is in fact another way to think about the morphology of the pluperfect subjunctive. I'd prefer to not discuss it here. You can ask me about it in class if you want. It involves a form, a perfect infinitive, that we haven't learned yet. So let's just leave it as the book suggests. And that is to say that these endings, isem, isses, isset, etc., are the pluperfect subjunctive endings. You add them to the perfect stem. And now the morphology is so simple, the textbook doesn't even bother to write all the forms out for you. They just put the first person singular. There you see parawisem. Of course, it would be parawisses, parawisset, etc. So it really is quite easy. Once again, the morphology shouldn't cause you any problems. And again, too, it's pretty darn easy to recognize as pluperfect subjunctive when you see it in context. Now, what about translating? What's the translation for the pluperfect subjunctive? Once again, as we've seen all along with the subjunctive, there really is no formulaic translation. You really have to determine how it's being used in order to render it into English. And the pluperfect subjunctives we're seeing in Chapter 35 are certainly no exception. For now, as of Chapter 35, you're only going to see the pluperfect subjunctive in cum clauses. And when you see cum beginning a sentence, beginning a clause rather, for now, translate it as when. It's actually a little bit more complicated than this, and later in the textbook it will be fleshed out more fully. But now you're going to see only, you're going to see cum only when it means when. And it's used in the following contexts. When I had arrived in Africa, when the ship had departed, when we were waiting in the forum, etc. The first thing you're likely to ask is, why the heck is that subjunctive? And the answer is, who knows? It really isn't, on the face of it, such a logical place to see the subjunctive. We could explain it in a number of ways, but let's not discuss that here. Just rather accept the fact that cum clauses very often take the subjunctive. Now, since it doesn't really make so much sense to us, to our English-speaking brains, that the subjunctive is used here, when we translate it into English, therefore, we are not using any subjunctive-y translation, but rather like the ones I had just told you, which are using indicative in English. In other words, we're not really sure why the subjunctive is used here. Therefore, when we translate into English, it's going to end up in the indicative. As I had said, when I had arrived in Africa, when the ship had departed, when we were waiting in the form, etc. Notice those are not subjunctive-y type translations at all, but rather quite indicative. Therefore, we can make a rather neat rule for translating cum clauses, cum plus subjunctive clauses, and that is, now it won't work 100% of the time, but most of the time you'll be pretty darn close, and that is to say, translate the subjunctive in cum clauses like the corresponding tense of the indicative. So if you were to see a pluperfect, the morphology of which we just learned, if you were to see a pluperfect subjunctive in a cum clause, translate it as a pluperfect indicative. When I had arrived in Africa, when the ship had departed. Really exactly like we translated pluperfect indicative in Latin. Likewise, you'll also often see, for instance, imperfect subjunctives in cum clauses. Translate it like the corresponding tense of the imperfect indicative. When we were waiting in the forum. When we were waiting. It sounds like the imperfect indicative from Latin 1. So that's a neat rule of thumb that makes it really quite easy for formulaic translation. Translate the subjunctive in cum clauses like the corresponding translation of the indicative, like the corresponding indicative. Again, it won't always make natural English, but we can live with that for a rule of thumb. And I think that's it, both for the pluperfect subjunctive and cum clauses. Pretty easy stuff.